Welcome to Write a Reply. This is our community-based show where we respond to contentious issues in the mainstream media. Today we are looking at an article in Ground Up, written about an anti-Israel protest that took place outside the Cape Town Holocaust and Genocide Center. The article touches on the relationship between Zionism and Judaism, Holocaust inversion, and Jewish plurality. Daniel Ben-Ami is a London-based journalist and author specializing in economics and finance. But he has also founded the website Radicalism of Fools to counter the increase in anti-Semitism. Daniel, welcome and thanks so much for joining me. Tell me why you started the Radicalism of Fools.
Yeah, well, I started in 2021 because at that time there was a relatively small scale Israeli incursion into Gaza in response to rocket attacks. So nothing on the scale we've seen since 2023. But I started it not because of Israel's incursion, but because of the response. I could already see that there was, in some quarters of society, a really hysterical response saying that it's in the nature of Israel to murder children, which obviously is reminiscent of a classic anti-Semitic trope, that Israel was equivalent to the Nazis, which seemed to me to be complete historical ignorance. So I thought anti-Semitism I think it's becoming much more of a problem, and I needed a platform, the Radicalism of Fools, to try and look at that, but look at it more deeply than a lot of people have done in the past.
So I imagine post-October the 7th, the anti-Semitism that arose must have taken you by surprise, or not really?
Well, I mean, to a degree, I'd already anticipated in 2021 when I set up my website, because it wasn't in response to the 7th of October, but I was surprised by the scale of it. Just really phenomenal. And the lack of challenge in many quarters, people you might expect to challenge it, people who call themselves anti-racist, but going along with it. So as I say, people are entitled to criticize Israel, that's fine, but when they start talking about Israel as the epitome of evil in the world, as a child murdering state, that kind of thing, that's not criticism. That is kind of hysterical, seeing Israel as a kind of evil force in the world.
Okay, let's take on that theme of seeing Israel as an evil force in the world and apply it to the article by Nathan Geffen in Ground Up. He notes that the Holocaust and genocide are at the heart of the ideological battle of the Gaza crisis. Would you agree with that?
I think they are. I don't think they should be, but yeah, I think they are. I think the anti-Israel campaign has quite successfully raised the question of genocide. I mean, I think there's certainly suffering in Gaza. I don't think it's a genocide, but I think they've been quite successful in terms of putting it onto the agenda and framing the discussion in that way.
Yeah, I think nothing we talk about can diminish the suffering that is taking place in Gaza,
sure.
And that it is a humanitarian crisis, and that our hearts go out to all innocents in this conflict that are suffering.
Absolutely,
and
yeah.
there are many. The question, I guess, is are we seeing in this article a little bit of Holocaust denialism or inversion?
Well, it's not denialism because it's saying the Holocaust happened. It's much more inversion and relativization. Because I think people who compare Israel to the Nazis or compare what's happening in Gaza, and there's a debate to be had about whose fault that is, which maybe we'll cover. I don't think it's Israel's fault. But people who compare what's happening in Gaza to the Holocaust, I think it shows that they understand neither thing. They don't understand the Holocaust, they don't understand the Nazi regime, and they don't understand what's happening in Gaza because they're very, very different kind of phenomenon. A degree of tragedy in both of them, but they're not the same thing at all.
Daniel, why do you think they do it then?
Well, because I think they see that Israel's legitimacy, to a large extent, depends on it being a reaction against anti-Semitism. They want to. I think it's really about delegitimizing Israel, and they see Israel as evil. They don't see. When I look at Israel and the conflict around Israel with the Palestinians, I see a very tragic, complex situation. I do see Palestinian suffering. I see it's very, very difficult being an Israeli in Israel at the moment as well. They're under huge amounts of pressure. So I see a tragic, complicated situation. They see and when I say they, I'm talking about the kind of anti-Israel activists. They see what, in my view, is a very crass, simplistic morality tale where Israel represents evil, the Palestinians represent good. There's no complexity. If you talk about complexity, they'll really kind of lay into you for that. So it's very much framed by them seeing the whole conflict as a very simplistic morality tale, whereas I think it is very, very different from that.
I mean, let's just go back to the kind of Holocaust inversion, because we're talking about a protest that took place outside the Holocaust and Genocide Center in Cape Town. Is that in and of itself problematic?
Yeah, I mean, it's problematic for various reasons. First of all, I think the role of a museum, as I understand it, it's basically a museum. It does talk about what's happening or what happened in Rwanda and the former Yugoslavia and so on. But it is essentially a museum. And the role of a museum, in my view, should not be to take a particular political view, but to transmit knowledge about, well, in this case, about the past to the current generation and new generations. They just want to use the whole kind of genocide, Holocaust allegation to demonize and delegitimize Israel. And I think they're completely wrong about that. I don't think there's no comparison between the Holocaust and what's happening in Gaza. I think that's ludicrous if you know about both things.
I mean, you talk about demonizing Israel. It almost sounds like you're talking about two ideological differences of how we view the war. Whereas I'm wondering if there's something a little bit more sinister in using the Holocaust, the greatest tragedy that has happened to the Jews, and using it against them to attack them.
Yeah, but I don't think the two things are mutually exclusive. So, yeah, the obviously Israel's, I mean, Zionism started before the Holocaust, but the Holocaust gave the state of Israel a huge amount of legitimacy because people saw that the Jews were very vulnerable without a nation state. And so it gave a lot of support for Israel. And, in the international world, they saw the Jews had suffered. They saw 6 million Jews had been slaughtered in the Holocaust. They saw the Nazis had very systematically they wanted to they had plans to destroy the whole Jewish community. I mean, 6 million is terrible, but they had plans. I think they literally had names of all European Jews, including places like Switzerland and Britain, where the Nazis didn't, thankfully, occupy. So, yeah, it's completely illegitimate to make the comparison with Gaza, but at the same time, it kind of comes with a particular view, this kind of identity politics kind of view, where they think Jews are very privileged. They're kind of hyper-privileged in the world. The Palestinians are oppressed. You have to see the world in this very kind of crass view of oppressed versus oppressors. And Israel, because in their view it's an oppressor, it's behaving like the Nazis, and the Palestinians, because they're suffering, they're like the Jews, which is just, as I said, a very kind of simplistic, crass view of history. That's not how it works. That's it's a much more complicated phenomenon than that.
Yeah, I mean, I think at the heart of it, everybody accuses the other side of weaponizing the Holocaust, which I think is extremely problematic in and of itself. You mentioned Zionism starting before, obviously, the Holocaust. The term Zionism has also been kind of misused. And one of the things that the article looks at is he accuses Jews of conflating Zionism and Judaism. Do you think that's fair comment?
No, I think it's complete nonsense. It's kind of, I've been reading a lot of anti-Zionist literature recently because I think it's very important to know what your political opponents are saying. And they make accusations like this, which are really just not true, or at least caricatures of what people say, or they take the most unsophisticated people and kind of even then caricature what they say. I mean, for me, there are different strands in Zionism, but for me, what Zionism meant as a modern political movement was a movement that emerged in late 19th century Europe in response to a surge in anti-Semitism at that time, and we can go into the reasons for that. We probably don't have time, but there was a huge surge in anti-Semitism in Europe in the late 19th century. And it said, we Jews need a Jewish state. And the kind of what is generally regarded as the founding text of political Zionism by Theodor Herzl was called the Jewish state, because they thought, well, all these other different groups in Europe have states, and that makes them less vulnerable, whereas the Jews don't have a state. Therefore, what Herzl said and various other people too is, we Jews, we need to have a state. I think that's what's at the core of modern political Zionism.
Daniel, I can't talk for the UK, but I do know that the overwhelming majority of South African Jews identify with Israel in some way, be it religious, be it political, be it cultural. We have some connection to Israel. Obviously, Jews are very heterogeneous. Where do we draw the line where who speaks on behalf of the Jews when we have a very small minority fronting for groups that are anti-Israel activists? Where do we see that heterogeneity move, if that makes sense?
I mean, in that sense, I don't think you could have someone speaking for the Jews as a whole, because, as you say, Jews have very different political views. You have right-wing Jews, you have left-wing Jews, you have moderate Jews in the center. So it would be very peculiar if Jews all had one political view and one organization could speak for them as a kind of aggregate group. I mean, it's true in Britain too, and there are actually very good statistics in relation to what Jews in Britain think. Certainly the vast majority of Jews support Zionism. Yeah. Certainly if you ask them, do you support Israel's right to exist? The vast majority of Jews would say yes. A lot would have criticisms, but they would say we respect Israel's right to exist. There are some people who are non-Zionists. Either they don't know, they don't care, they're not interested. And there's a small proportion who are anti-Zionist for various reasons. So there are some who are anti-Zionist for religious reasons. I mean, this is quite a small group, but they say, well, a Jewish state should be set up by God, not by man, not by human beings. So we think it's evil there's a Jewish state, because God didn't create it. And then there's a small but growing group on the left, if you can call it that, who buy into this kind of identity politics of, the world is structured according to oppressed and oppressor, and Israel is an oppressor state, and they are anti-Zionist. So Jews, as you say, it's a very heterogeneous group, as you would expect, with very different political views. And I don't think any one group can speak on behalf of Jews in that sense, but I do think the vast majority of Jews are pro-Zionist in the sense of supporting Israel's right to exist. Even though they might criticize the present government or particular policies, they think Israel should be there. They're certainly very much against Israel being destroyed, which is what the anti-Zionist movement wants.
Yeah, I think that for me is kind of what the intention regarding Israel is. Is it to make it a better Israel, a safer Israel? Or is it to kind of eliminate Israel and demonize it? And I think that all the points you've made in kind of debunking this article have pointed to the fact that this is kind of calling, what Nathan Geffen is basically calling for is the demonizing of Israel and ultimately for its eradication. Would you agree?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think there's been an interesting or a bad shift in the anti-Israel movement since 7th of October. Because before the 7th of October, I mean, it was still a problematic movement, but generally speaking, they would talk about the occupation, and by that they would generally mean the occupation of the West Bank. And they would say, well, Israel should withdraw from the West Bank. Whereas since the 7th of October, it's become a much more mainstream view, or the mainstream view in those circles, that Israel should be destroyed. So that's what they mean when they say from the river to the sea, in other words, from the Mediterranean to the River Jordan. What they don't say in those words, Israel should be destroyed, but that's what it means. And when they talk about genocide, it's not really about, there's a technical legal definition of genocide, which I don't think Israel meets anything like that. But that's, in a way, that's not what they mean. what they're really saying is that it's an evil state. It's a genocide committing, child killing, Nazi-like state, and therefore it should be destroyed. That's very much what they're arguing.
Oh, thank you. Thank you for exposing that, because sometimes within the slogans and the fact that, that things are really bleak, it's very hard to mislead people into thinking what isn't there. So I really appreciate your time for helping me debunk this article.
Well, good to speak to you.